Hello and welcome to Science Tutor's YouTube channel and today's mini anatomy and physiology review. My name is Professor Dodge, and today I'm going to give you a little review, a basic introduction to the epidermis of the skin. Let's get started. Check out some slides. Okay. All right, the epidermis of the skin. As most of you know, the skin is the largest organ of our bodies. It's the outer protective covering, and it's part of your integumentary system. If we look here, we can see an illustration of a cross-section through the skin. And just to orient you, here's the superficial outer surface, right? And the skin is technically made up of two parts. We have this superficial area here. You can see they're trying to peel it away. This is referred to as the epidermis. That's going to be the focus of today's mini review. And deep to that superficial epidermis, right underneath here, we can see it's the larger part of this section of skin is the dermis. And then deep to the dermis is a layer that's called the hypodermis or the subcutaneous layer. Technically, this is not part of the skin, but we do study it when we study the skin. So today's focus again is going to look at the superficial part of your skin, which is called the epidermis. Okay? The epidermis is made up of epithelial tissue. More specifically, it's a stratified squamous epithelium that's keratinized. So if you remember from your histology studies, stratified means there is more than one layer of epithelial cells. And in the case of the skin, there are many, many, many layers. And keratinized refers to the fact that the mature epithelial cells of your skin produce a protein called keratin. It's a fibrous protein. And really what it does for our skin is helps to make it waterproof or water resistant. It helps to keep the water in so it doesn't evaporate across your skin, so you don't lose that water and dehydrate, right? Other things to think about when we think of the epithelium is that it's avascular. All epithelial tissue lacks a blood supply, so there are no blood vessels in the epidermis. The epithelial cells will rely on diffusion from the underlying connective tissue. The other thing is located throughout the epidermis. There are a variety of different nerve endings that allow us to detect sensations, including touch and pain. There's also temperature, for example. And the other thing about the epithelium of the epidermis is that it has a great regenerative capability. We're going to see that there are epithelial stem cells located in the epidermis whose job it is to divide and divide and divide, and of course, give rise to new cells. So those are sort of the key characteristics of the epithelium that makes up that epidermis, that outer superficial layer of our skin. And here is a histology picture. And just to orient you again, this is looking at a cross-section of skin. This is a fairly thick skin, a section of thick skin. We find thick skin really on the palms of your hands and the soles of your feet, for example. And again, it's this area here, this superficial area that makes up your epidermis. And again, this is where the epithelial tissue is. Deep to the epidermis, we can see underneath here, this is the dermis, and the bulk of the dermis is made up of connective tissue. And in particular, what we can see here are bundles, thick bundles of collagen fibers. And you can see the orientation of those fibers is organized in such a way that the bundles are not parallel to one another. And that's key because the dermis, due to that arrangement of collagen, can really resist forces in multiple directions. But again, that's part of the dermis, and so we'll save that for another lecture. Here we have a high-powered picture of that epidermis. Again, here we can see this whole area is the epidermis in this histology slide. The thing to note is that the deeper portion of the epidermis, we can really see the stratified squamous epithelial cells. We can see individual cells, right? We can see the nuclei in those cells, but as we move further away towards the surface, we no longer can see the nuclei in those cells. And that's because the further away towards the surface, what we have are cells that are essentially dead cells. And the reason for that is, if you remember at the beginning, I said this epidermis, this epithelial tissue, is avascular. These cells need to rely on blood vessels located here in the underlying dermis. So oxygen and nutrients need to diffuse from these blood vessels to these epithelial cells. And you probably know that diffusion is only good over a relatively short distance. So the cells that are closest to the underlying dermis receive the oxygen and nutrients they need. So those cells remain metabolically active. But as you move further away from that blood supply, the cells essentially begin to die. Literally, we have layer after layer of dead cells here. And really what's remaining is the keratin fibers. And again, that's going to be important. Look at the barrier that produces. Those keratin fibers are helping to keep the water in the skin so it doesn't evaporate into the environment. And the other thing, some of the properties of these keratin fibers include antimicrobial. They prevent certain types of bacteria from entering. So that is sort of a key feature of the epidermis. If we look here at this illustration, we can see that the epidermis, the layer of stratified squamous epithelium, the many layers of epithelial cells, are actually divided into 5 different strata, if you will. And the very bottom layer here, the deepest layer of the epithelium, is called the stratum basale layer. This is a single layer of epithelial cells, and the majority of cells here are stem cells. They are in the process of dividing by mitosis to produce more cells, and as they divide, they get pushed towards the surface. And as they move towards the surface, they begin to become specialized. Because remember, a stem cell is pretty much an undifferentiated cell, an unspecialized cell whose job it is to divide by mitosis and give rise to more stem cells. So most of the cells here are those stem cells in various stages of mitosis. Another key cell that's present in that stratum basale, we can see here, this is the melanocyte, and this is the cell that produces the melanin pigment. The melanocyte then passes that melanin pigment to other epithelial cells in the epidermis, and that's how our skin gets its color. So we all basically have the same number of melanocytes, but of course we all make different amounts of melanin pigment and we distribute that differently. And therefore we all have a slightly different skin color, right? Other cells that are present often in this basal layer here are tactile cells, right? Touch and pain receptors. And lastly, we may come across a Merkel cell, which helps to provide us with a little bit of defense. It's like a macrophage. The next layer is called the stratum spinosum, and that's just a histology term. For whatever reason, as those cells are beginning to mature, those epithelial cells are undergoing their genetically programmed differentiation. We see these little spines start to appear in the junctions between the cells, and so we're going to refer to this as the stratum spinosum, rather. Again, we can see here another one of those dendritic cells is also located in this layer. As you move further up, we have the stratum granulosum, and here we can see granules. What's happening is the proteins that are needed to organize into the keratin fibers are being synthesized. So really here, these epithelial cells are maturing. They're becoming mature keratinocytes, right? The stratum lucidum here is just a clear layer, and beyond that is the stratum corneum. This is that layer of keratin fibers where we see all of those dead cells, right? And that provides that good protective barrier. So those are the layers. And again, this is just a summary of the cells that are present in the epidermis. We have the undifferentiated stem cells dividing by mitosis and to give rise to new cells. And eventually they're going to mature into the keratinocytes. Keratinocytes, those epithelial cells, right, that synthesize the keratin fibers to help waterproof your skin. The melanocytes in the basal layer that provide melanin pigment, which gives your skin its color, but also is really important because it shields our epithelial DNA from the powerful UV rays of the sun. And remember, ultraviolet rays carry a lot of energy, enough to destroy the DNA. So we want to protect that DNA, and that's the job of the melanin pigment. Lastly, those tactiles we said, for example, the sensory receptors for touch and pain, etc. And then those dendritic cells, which are macrophages, right? So those are all of the cells of the epidermis. And this has been a mini review of the epidermis. And if you'd like to have some more information about our tutoring services, you can certainly find more information on our website. If you have any questions, you can certainly email us here. And if you've liked this video, please indicate that and subscribe to our channel. Thank you.